The content of this podcast includes topics that may be difficult for some people to confront or discuss. These conversations can be triggering. If you are underage, please speak to your guardian before continuing.
You will be arrested. Like, I'm just going to be straight up with you. Like, I consult with the camp. If they call me and they tell me that you did such and such, I will tell them, have him arrested. And the numbers drop by a lot,
wow.
Right, in terms of what it is that's going on. But it's not foolproof.
Here we are back with another episode of That's an Issue. In this week's episode, Dr. Tara and Yoni sit down with Rabbi Dr. Gavriel Fagin. He's also a Lord, but we don't really get into that part of his life in this episode. But we talk to him about a very heavy topic, sexual abuse. It's something that has, been spoken about a lot more lately, and we try to talk about different angles that maybe aren't spoken about as much. Dr. Fagin deals with both victims and offenders, and we kind of get into that world with him, and we kind of define what is an offender, what does an offender look like, what are the things that someone who doesn't have experience in this I guess sexual abuse world, what they could do to help. And I took some notes actually because I was in the room. We define what is sexual abuse, how prevalent it is in our community, what's the benefit of working with offenders, the different levels of sexual offenders, and just really everything around it. This episode goes a little longer than typical, but it's just every moment. There's so many wise words by Dr. Fagin. And enough about me. Let's get into this week's episode.
Mental health, relationships, those are loaded topics and something that affects every part of our lives. But we aren't having enough open conversations about it.
And that's an issue. Okay, tonight we have a esteemed guest, Lord Dr. Rabbi Gavriel Fagin. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to talk tonight about a topic that is not spoken about often, and you have a unique expertise, and I want to jump into that. So, can you describe to the audience and the viewers, the listeners, what it is that you do?
Sure. In general, I deal, unfortunately, a lot with male victims of sexual abuse, as well as teenage offenders who might or might not have been abused themselves, as well as male offenders.
Wow. And how did you get into this field?
I don't know. I have a degree in forensic psychology, which is like psychology in the law. And I worked in Bellevue for a while. My father-in-law likes to say, he had a son-in-law in Bellevue and then a son-in-law in jail because I worked in Rikers Island.
Oh, wow.
Oh, cool.
And which is just awesome. Whole separate show maybe. But two of the populations that people did not want to work with in jail were arsonists and sex offenders. So, being like the little schnook right outside of school, I'm like, all right, I'll do it. So
it's so funny. When I was in graduate school, they would go around and ask people, like, who would you not feel comfortable working with? And that's what everybody said.
Right.
And then the professor would be like, okay, so who's going to work with them?
Right. So it's kind of my personality of like, all right, like, let's try. So I did that for a little while, hanging out in Rikers for a little bit, which is awesome experience, great learning experience. And then actually OHEL had started up a victim and offender program. So I applied for a job there. They had started their program maybe a couple of years earlier. And it turned out that you had people who are still in the field who really like developed into like, the go-to type people. The training was amazing. The colleagues were amazing. We developed like this really dark humor to kind of like cope with everything that we were dealing with.
Right.
And at that time, it was just like those cases that were coming in were just like literally the worst of the worst. And so we trained like on the worst heart-wrenching cases, like, back then, so I'm talking, maybe 15, 20 years ago. the cases that were getting reported to the police, the cases that were getting reported to Child Protective Services. We've come so far, but the cases back then, I mean, they were intense. So, we really got to learn on those.
Well, why were they more intense?
I think like the community just like wasn't up to what it's thank God up to. We obviously, we have miles to go before we sleep. But it wasn't even close. But these are guys, that were, identified by the community as offenders. This is just when, male victims were coming forward and saying that they were victimized. These were people, who are on probation and parole. So we got really the gamut of, not only the victims, but also the offenders. And philosophically, the program, was really based in this idea of really trying to split your time, as much as possible, doing the work with victims as well as doing the offender work, which is a philosophy that, I and my practice have kept really throughout, which is tremendous.
And now you're still at OHEL?
No, I haven't been there in 15 years or something like that.
Okay, so now you have your own practice.
Private practice, and partners, associates. We have offices in 5 locations. Unfortunately, it's waiting lists and whatever it is. Wow. The amount of work that there is to do, especially in the past couple of weeks. It's just like
right.
things. There's an ebb and flow of everything, but definitely news cycle. Impacts all of that, and we just try to be as helpful as we can.
You work with only from people?
So now, I mean, it used to be that we didn't, but now there's unfortunately enough work to only work with from people. So our practice, I would say 99% only works with male clients. So we're dealing only male abuse victims, and offenders and families and, guys getting in trouble in yeshiva for all sorts of things, and we're exposed to the gamut, of the community, the most litvish of places in Lakewood to the most Hasidish places, and, trying to help out as many people as we can.
So in your experience, how does one identify if someone sees someone going through something? What are some signs that could be indicating that there's been, some abuse going on?
Yeah.
Wait, could I interrupt for a second?
Please.
Could we define sexual abuse first for people maybe who aren't familiar or think it's something it's not?
Yeah, so it's a big debate in the scientific research, kind of how to define it. So they're basically, you can kind of take a very broad definition of sexual abuse or a much more narrow one. A narrow definition of sexual abuse is when an individual touches somebody in a sexual way or with sexual intent. Typically, there's, for the legal definition, there's, some sort of age difference that needs to take place or a significant power differential. Right. So depending on, jurisdiction, that could either be 3 years or 4 year age difference, and that would be considered sexual abuse and, obviously above that as well. Unless there's a significant power differential, in which case, we kind of, limit some of those times. But basically, essentially, it's having some sort of unwanted sexual contact. Which is interesting clinically, because if you ask somebody whether they're sexually abused, very often, even if it turns out that they don't necessarily relate to that term, because they kind of think that it has to involve force or that it has to be completely unwanted. And especially when it comes to male sexual abuse, a lot of times that's not the dynamic at all. So that can be confusing for people.
What do you mean, not the dynamic?
Meaning, if let's say you have a 13-year-old kid that's approached by a 17 or 18-year-old, friend of their brother, something like that. Sometimes, while technically that's sexual abuse, and it certainly is, more fundamentally, the 13 or 14-year-old might feel on a physical level, right, that's something that's not all that disturbing to them. They might actually feel that it's cool to be hanging out with the 18-year-old. They might feel that it's, something that's interesting to them to think about. And only years later, it kind of hits them like, whoa, holy cow. Like, I was 13 and he was 18. Like, that's not normal, or that's not appropriate, or that's not, fill in the blank. So a lot of times it doesn't click, especially, if there's some sort of imagination of friendship. A lot of people speak about grooming. Grooming behaviors is kind of when somebody's nice to somebody, right, with the ultimate intention of doing something sexual. But you really only know if it's grooming looking back. It's only Monday morning quarterbacking, right? Sometimes it's just somebody being really nice to somebody.
That's a really good point.
So, so it's really, really hard to know. And there's some kids that, need a big brother, or they need, a mentor, or, somebody in their life, or whatever it might be. And then they kind of look back on that situation and they're like, wow, he showed me porn, when I was 13 years old. And it's like, well, okay, so in a broader definition of sexual abuse, exposing somebody 3 or 4 years younger to pornography, that's also a form of abuse. So, depending on the definition that we're looking at, really goes towards also the numbers of people who were abused. So my dissertation was actually on Orthodox males who were sexually abused. And if we look at that very narrow definition of sexual abuse, right, the narrow definition being, whether there was actual physical touch. So it was about 1 in 5 of the guys. So about 20%. But if we broaden the definition to being exposed to something, some sort of pornographic material, it turns out to be about 1 in 4. So we're potentially talking about a lot of people.
How many people did you?
So it was over 200 people in the survey, and kind of like the spectrum of orthodoxy, but it was only men.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so let me ask another question, definition-wise. Let's say we go with the broader definition. Are the impacts, like the negative impacts, similar across the board?
Yeah. It's a great, as in, hey, that's a great question. Hey, I hear the question. So here's the issue with sexual abuse, and that is it's not homogeneous. And the responses, while there are typical response patterns, the intensity of that response is mostly unknown. So you can have somebody who is abused, what we objectively would say, wow, that was really, really bad abuse. And they seem to be okay, whatever okay means. And then you have people where you and I might say, okay, that's bad, but that, that wasn't so terrible. And their response to that is just, lifelong. So it's really, really hard to kind of, be in predictive mode of, who's going to be affected and in what way, which kind of makes this work extremely challenging. But I mean, if we can,
because there's no way to predict.
There's really no way to predict. I've been doing this for a while, and I can't predict. We can look at risk factors, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the one thing we do know is that the more somebody is abused by one person, and the more that they're abused by somebody in a position of authority, or if they're abused by multiple people, they tend to do much worse. Which is kind of intuitive.
So if it's for a longer time, if it's an authority figure,
and if
it's more than one person,
multiple abusers, yeah.
Okay, that would be the worst outcomes.
Usually, typically.
Okay, so you said typical response patterns.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit what that looks like?
Sure. So in men, kind of, not surprisingly, the number one, issue that male victims of sexual abuse deal with is some sort of dysfunction when it comes to sexual regulation. So that most typically is hypersexuality. So that's where you get the sexual addictions. That's where you get the multiple partners. That's where you get kind of, all the exploration, type of behavior that's taking place. But it can also be the other end of the gamut that, there's some guys that develop a hyposexuality, and that can come out in terms of just becoming asexual. That can be sexual confusion. That can be, issues with impotence, premature ejaculation, all those kinds of issues, potentially can be on that end of the gamut. But there's some sort of, typically there's some sort of dysregulation that's taking place in terms of, their overall sexual functioning, which is not all that surprising, in that if you think about it, right, their first exposure typically to sexuality has been a traumatic exposure to sexuality. At that point, that's 100% of their knowledge, right, about a sexual experience, most typically. And we know just, from like fourth grade math, right, if you average anything into a 0 or into 100, like it schleps it, wherever it goes. So kind of getting beyond that in terms of the traumatic sexualization, I mean, that's huge. And then a bunch of the, the other factors, real issues with trust, issues with betrayal, a sense of powerlessness, that's all there. And depending on who the person doing the abuse was, we also have to look at, relatively significant issues in spirituality or religiosity, especially if the person doing the abuse was kind of that authority figure.
Okay. Well, what about female? I know you said you don't really work with females. So
Yeah,
could you give us a little insight into that?
I have no idea. We don't, our practice, I have not, maybe never, it's probably extreme, but I don't treat female sexual abuse victims. Throughout the years, we've had a couple of female offenders. The identification is always very, very difficult, for female offenders. But experience has mostly not been kind of in that realm. Like, unfortunately, it's just been enough work, to stick with the guys.
Okay.
Do you know maybe why any of these sexual encounters happen? Is there like a pattern to when or why, what ages, or like is camp, for example, a bad environment, or is certain scenarios not a good place for this?
Yeah. So the really maybe scary part, like I'm speaking maybe with my parent hat on now. The scary part is that like every place is a potential place. Generally speaking, kids don't get molested, sexually abused by people that they don't know. Generally speaking, so to say it in the positive, generally speaking, it's somebody that they know, and generally it's somebody that they know really, really, really well. So, the whole idea of stranger danger, like it doesn't exist. Like, I'm sorry, Nancy Reagan, like I'm really, really sorry. It's not there. And we teach our kids, don't take the candy from the guy, from the cuckoo looking guy, in the car. Okay, it's true. Don't take the candy. Like, we don't want that. But upwards of 80%, of the abuse is people that the victim actually knew, generally trusted, had, interaction with. So as a parent, I guess getting back to the point, as a parent, Shabbos afternoon is like nap time, and so leaving kids alone, sometimes in some houses, like you never know who's coming in and out. So that's always a place. Camp is definitely a place. School buses. If you think about it, right, we send our kids to school. We pay a lot of money to send kids to school. We should probably do a podcast about all the money that's spent on yeshivas or something like that.
Yeah, kosher money. There is one already.
Right. So we spend all this time, and if you think about it, right, in camp, they're all the chaperones, right, are on camp buses. So how come we don't have that at yeshivas? I can't tell you how many times, even something relatively quote unquote innocuous, that's taking place in the back of a bus. If you have an 8th grader on the same bus as a 4th grader, right, and 8th grader is doing something or showing something or talking about something, like that's traumatic potentially to the 4th grader. So school buses, when I started this work, one of the occupational hazards, and I feel terrible for my lovely wife, is like our kids till they're like 20 don't go on like the yellow school buses. They just don't go because it's just wacky.
Do you send them to sleepaway camp?
We do. With a lot of instruction.
Right.
Beforehand, which is also.
So let's talk about that then.
Yeah, sure.
What kind of instruction?
Here's the thing, right? I've seen parents make their kids absolutely loony about when they go to sleepaway camp or when they go to yeshiva dorm or whatever it is, and like the parents are the ones traumatizing kids. So there's this crazy balance that we have to find that's not in some sort of, guide, to find that balance between really speaking to our kids and having those conversations at each, kind of developmental stage or chronological stage, that they might be going through, but not kind of like what Dr. Pelkowitz calls inflicting help. Like you can't like shove it down their face. Right. And then there's also a culture that needs to be created. When you're giving a 3-year-old a bath, and you hand them the soap or the washcloth or whatever it is, and, you say, this is the only area that, mommy or daddy, whoever's, giving the bath is allowed to touch, the doctor, when mommy or daddy are in the room. They're kind of like all these exceptions, but, kind of like inculcating kids with this idea that this is a private area that isn't to be touched. And all the prevention programs that take place in school, like, those are awesome.
My daughter had one today. Isn't that funny? It was today. I got an email today with the program
and
they did.
They need to happen, and they're wonderful. But the scary secret, kind of like, again, as parent, but also therapist, kind of seeing this is, unfortunately, a lot of times kids just don't put it together. They have the theoretical knowledge. If they were to take a test, on the abuse prevention thing, they'll do great on the test. But when it actually happens, it's overwhelming, and they don't necessarily put two and two together, which is really, really scary. Especially if the programs are directed towards stranger danger or your weird and wacky uncle. It's like, well, I know he's weird and wacky. Like, I know to stay away. But, it's the, my brother's friend or, whatever that is. And it's hard. It's hard for kids to put that together. And then you have, issues of authority, that kind of get thrown in there. It's hard to say no, kind of kids are inculcated with, respect for elders and, for people older. So, that's also a dynamic that gets thrown in there. So we have to do the prevention programs, and we've gotten good at doing the prevention programs, but they don't prevent, they just lower. And
Right.
it's a scary thought.
Wow.
How could we prevent? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, we can't.
It's not like it's
I
it's
don't
going to
think
happen.
so. The
It's going to
prevention-
happen for sure. We just want to lower it as much as we can.
I think that's the approach. Early on, I had kind of like this existential moral dilemma. Like, why am I spending time dealing with like sex offenders? Like, I'll just spend all my time dealing with victims. And then there was kind of like this light bulb moment where it's like, hey, wait a second. Like, it's really super, super important to deal with victims of sexual abuse. But if we assume, which we did then, because again, we were dealing with like the worst of the worst offenders, but it's, even true, on lower risk offenders, typically offenders will have multiple
Right.
victims, right, throughout their lifetime. So if I'm only treating the victims, right, it's kind
You're
of
playing
like
catch up.
totally. It's like putting duct tape around, my leaking faucet. Like, yeah, it's going to work for a little bit, but like the leak is still there. Which, kind of like really motivated that work to deal with offenders, because then we're literally shutting off the faucet, hopefully if you do it right and,
So what makes an offender not feel bad about their, what they're doing? How is
who
that?
says they don't feel bad?
I don't know. I assume.
well, we'll ask the
I don't know.
question.
Yeah.
Do they feel
Do
bad?
they
Do
feel
they feel
bad?
bad?
Yeah.
So just like victims are not homogeneous at all, so offenders are not homogeneous at all. Part of the work when an offender comes in is to do a really comprehensive assessment in terms of being able to identify risk. And generally speaking, there's, three classifications of risk: low, medium, and high. There are gradations in between. I'm not going to bore you with all the, all the details. But there's some offenders that are clearly high risk. And those are offenders who have been at it for years and probably will be. And the best we can probably do is just, try to manage them or slow them down or make it impossible for them to offend again. So, that's where being in jail can help. That's where civil commitment can be helpful, et cetera, et cetera. Then,
Okay, cut it. Sorry,
Yeah,
I don't want to
sorry.
interrupt you. When you say high risk, like who are they at high risk to?
yeah. Okay. So
Humans?
humans,
Right,
you
like
said?
they're
I'm
not.
saying
They're
high risk to
like
humans?
no,
Everyone?
meaning
Like what
mean like what
categories?
they're going
Right.
around the street, like to
Right.
random people. Like we're saying no, that's mostly people they know. So
Right.
they're at high risk to their family. They're like
Right.
what's the high risk?
So the conventional wisdom is that even within high-risk offenders, and certainly true of medium and low-risk offenders, there's some general categories that people will offend in, and generally speaking, they don't cross those categories. So, for example, if somebody offends against prepubescent kids, they probably will not, if they're low risk or medium risk, probably will not cross into the category of adolescent or adult. If somebody's only, somebody who's a rapist of only adult females will probably not molest kids. Somebody who's offending against boys typically will not offend against girls, typically speaking. So generally speaking, and this is, like all of us, we're creatures of habit, so to speak, and generally speaking, people don't cross categories. When people start crossing categories of gender, when people start crossing categories of developmental stage, when people start crossing categories of marital status, when people start crossing category of inter-family versus intra-family, that's when you kind of have been elevated to that higher risk categories when you start, making those crossovers.
Okay,
so
because it's like it's less predictable what they're going to do.
Right, that would be now high risk because
Okay.
we have prepubescence, pubescence, adults, males, females, in your family, outside of your family that you've all molested, right? You're a complete mess, right? And you're extremely dangerous for all of those people versus somebody who, again, and this is horrible, right? And we don't want to minimize anything at all, but if somebody's maintaining one sort of status, right, it's much easier to manage and treat, right, and kind of shut that faucet than if they're going ahead and crossing all those boundaries.
Well, okay, so what do you do with a person like that?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, should we separate high risk from lower risk and
Yeah,
talk
it's-
about each of those separately?
yeah,
So
yeah.
what would you do with this high risk person? Like they have to sit in jail? Like that's the only answer?
So sometimes that's really the only thing that will stop. Civil commitment is always an issue. Now with the tiered system, people are aware of level 1 offender, level 2, level 3 offenders. Just very quickly, right? Level 1 is the lowest level. If somebody's charged with a felony of sexual abuse or sexual assault, so they go before a board and they get a level determination. In levels 2 and 3, there's community notification, so people get to know, kind of who's out there. They're available on Internet Registry.
Okay.
Level 1, not the case. Somebody could go into their local precinct and get a list of the level 1 offenders, but that's not available on the internet.
Okay.
So the highest risk offenders, right? I mean, those are the people, generally speaking, that either will be incarcerated, need to be incarcerated, civil commitment.
But aren't those usually, folks who are committing a crime?
Yes.
Well,
I mean,
all
all
of
of
this
them.
What I'm
is a
saying is
crime.
what I'm saying is that this, let's say someone molests someone within their, not underage, right? So you're not under 18, right? Let's say everyone's 18 and above.
Yeah.
There still could be a molesting factor, but there's no jail time. No one's going to
Right.
go on any.
So generally, we wouldn't call that molestation. It might be sexual assault. But molestation, we try to kind of reserve for that, kind of below.
So like
below
crimes,
18.
basically.
Right. Exactly. So you can have.
But
you
sexual assault's a crime.
Right. I mean, it is a crime.
Yeah, I think you meant like crime towards kids or
Right,
something like that. Yeah.
Because this is where I'm assuming, and it could be that it's a wrong assumption, that this discussion is not necessarily focused on crime. It's also focused on, people who are grooming or sexually assaulting different people, and they're over the age of 18. So the consent element is technically in the room,
Right.
but it's hard to know. And meaning obviously if we have somebody that's high risk to commit a crime, we have to incarcerate them and we have to make sure they don't do it, and as you said. But I'm assuming, and that comes into the practice of what you have to tell the police or the parents and all that stuff. But
Right. That's what I was wondering.
well-
Like, how many of the people that you see has it been reported as a
Right.
crime, and how many are just coming for help? And
Right. It's a really, really important question because there's a lot of confusion about this. So let's set this up.
right,
Right.
I just so that I can get because to me I see there are two things. One is underage
Right.
crime,
Yes.
and then there's after 18 grooming / sexual assault that
it's also
Isn't-
a crime.
it's also a crime that you can
No,
say?
am I wrong?
I mean, let's say you have
is that
right
a
if
crime?
you have a 35-year-old guy who's on a subway or on a city bus, right, and grabs somebody inappropriately.
Right, no, so that would be
right?
sexual assault.
Right.
I was referring to a more of a grooming. So somebody is they're both adults
Right.
in the sense legally,
Right.
and there's some sexual activity going on
Right.
at that. Do you deal with that as well?
Yeah, so that's where you kind of get into professional improprieties, right? That kind of exist. That could be a professional. Rabbinics is a profession. So you have let's say both of those parties would be above 18, but because there's that power differential that takes place, is it technically a crime? Might not be technically a crime, but morally, ethically,
Right.
In terms of that level of vulnerability, it's clearly there, right? If you have somebody coming to their Rav and talking about, Shalom Bayis issues, right? And then, there's some sort of activity taking place, technically there might not be a crime, but we have a problem.
So when you're helping these individuals who are offenders, as Dr. Tara was saying,
Oh, thank you.
how do you what's the duty to the, how do you balance the duty to the patient to help that person and send them to Rikers?
Right. Though there's good kosher food, that's actually a thing.
I actually visited Rikers Island I was a prosecutor.
Okay.
And they made us walk through there before you send someone to Rikers. They wanted us to
see
what it's like.
Yeah,
You said it was horrible.
It was pretty bad.
Yeah, it's nasty. I mean, it was nasty back then. I can't even imagine like the increased nastiness it's a whole complex. It's not,
Right.
People kind of imagine like, one facility. It's like 13, it's like 13 facilities.
A one-way
and a
bridge.
boat.
It's like a
and-
fortress.
Yeah.
It's
I
pretty
think it was like the first time that we were locked down for like 3 days that my wife finally said like, maybe you should start doing something else. When like we
Wow.
couldn't leave because like some former Marine had like dug a hole and he was between like two walls and that was wild. Anyway, but back to
Right. Wow.
back to the reporting issue. It can be very, very confusing for people. So there really are, when people talk about like reporting issues, there really are two very, very distinct things that people kind of like confabulate. So number one is what's called a mandated report. So in the state of New York, a whole bunch of people are mandated reporters, right? Anyone with a professional license, teachers, the list is long. But basically, right, anyone that for sure is in a licensed position, right, is what's called a mandated reporter. A mandated reporter means that if you see that a parent or guardian is abusing or neglecting their own child or their own person that they have guardianship over, that would be reportable to Child Protective Services. Nothing else is reportable to Child Protective Services, which means that if a 17-year-old kid comes in and says, I'm abusing my 9-year-old female neighbor, that would not be reportable to Child Protective Services, since that individual is not a parent or guardian of that child.
That sounds like a problem to me.
So that's number one with regards to the reporting issue. The second kind of report that people talk about is a criminal complaint that can
Calling
be
the
made,
police.
right? There you call the police. Therapists have no obligation to,
Unless it's actually happening.
even so.
Even if it's actually happening?
Therapists have no obligation to call right? If a 17-year-old comes in and says, I'm abusing my 9-year-old neighbor, right? There's a terrible moral, legal, ethical issue at play here, and we got to figure this out, and we will figure it out, hopefully, and come to some resolution in terms of how to keep people safe. But if he says, I'm going to do it tonight, right, so then that's a danger to self or others. That's a whole different category, right? That's the whole Tarasov duty to warn type situation. But let's say he says it's occurred in the past and I have no plans on doing it in the future. So that would not be reportable to Child Protective Services, and it would be up to the victim or the victim's parents or guardians to decide whether they would want to press charges or not. But now we get into the issue, right, of let's say you have the 16-year-old who's telling you about the 9-year-old, and the 9-year-old has never told his or her parents about the situation.
Do you have to tell the parents?
Right? I don't want to sit on that, but in the same vein, I have a duty to confidentiality. How do you now break that confidentiality if you don't feel that there's now an active risk? Let's say it happened 3 years ago, and the guy says, I've never done it again. So these are kind of, a lot of the moral dilemmas that take place that, people get very, very upset, and rightfully so, about, well, how come he didn't report it, and how come he didn't do this, that, or the other thing? And the answer is the reportable to Child Protective Services is so narrow. It's so narrow in terms of when that happens, and it's few and far between. Like, generally speaking, parents don't abuse or neglect their kids. Generally speaking, it happens. Of course, it happens. But it's such a narrow segment, right, of the population. Whereas and the times that people actually want to press charges, right? I mean, we could talk about that whole dynamic probably for hours, but ultimately that's not up to the therapist. That's up to the victim and or the victim's family.
But they don't even.
But they might not even know about it.
Wait, so how often does that happen in the frum community? I'm asking.
It's up there.
Meaning that they do press charges?
That they will press charges. It happens. But generally speaking, for a variety of reasons, some of which are totally understandable. All reasons are understandable. But some of the dynamics are totally understandable. Not, condoning not pressing charges. I think if people feel like it's the right thing, absolutely, they absolutely need to. But sometimes there are some dynamics that just make it absolutely impossible emotionally for someone to do that. I'm not saying it's literally impossible to pick up the phone, but it becomes so emotionally difficult to do, which is one of the dynamics as to why some victims don't come forward, because they know that this is going to really mess up the Hanukkah party. And to carry that around with them, right, knowing that at every family simcha they're going to have to see uncle whatever or cousin whoever or brother whatever, that dynamic, I mean, that weighs very, very heavily. And that's probably one of the biggest dynamics that keeps people, very silent in sharing the abuse.
So as a therapist dealing with a victim, right, who shares what happened with you, but let's say their family doesn't know or whatever it is, would you encourage them to tell the family? Like how would that weigh? Like the idea of the secret weighing,
right?
Like how would you help? How would you treat that?
Yeah, so it's really important to kind of like do that comprehensive assessment just to get the lay of the land in terms of who might be available for this individual to share this.
We're
with.
in treatment now for, let's say, a victim.
Right.
There's two different treatments, I'm assuming. One is for a victim and one is for an abuser.
Correct.
So
now, obviously, there's some overlap, right?
Right. So I guess let's just get let's
start with the victim, right?
The victim, right?
Yeah.
So if someone knows or sees that this might be happening, what treatments should?
So again, that's going to totally depend on age, right? If you have somebody under 18 under 18 or for sure under 16 in New York State, right, and they come in and they tell you about abuse, number one thing on my list is safety. Is this individual currently safe from the abuse, but also, in terms of suicidality, et cetera, et cetera. So is this person in a safe situation? And if not, right, that's kind of number one. And then number two, I want to work on, who can be the supports for this individual, right? If it's inside the family, so sometimes parents can be supportive, but unfortunately in a bunch of scenarios, right, the person doing the abuse could be the apple of the eye, of the parents or extended family or whatever it is. And, this is the kid that's been, quote unquote, a problem for so long. And kids don't know that, parents are going to believe them or kind of how the response is. So obviously the hope is that parents can be a great resource to a victim. Sometimes that can't take place. So, is it an extended family member? Is it a Rebbe? Is it, a principal? To be able to share that. The burden that victims carry is it's super, super heavy, totally weighs on them. Being able to share their victimization with other people is part and parcel of the treatment, just being able to unburden themselves with that or at least, feel that somebody's carrying the burden with them. Super, super important. To help with some technical planning, that's also important. And generally, like we say in victimization, you're only as sick as your secrets, and as long as those secrets can come out, that's really like super first, second, third, whatever somebody's up to step in terms of really trying to heal.
Are there support groups for people who have been victims?
Yeah. So typically they're a bunch, not enough, but there are a bunch of support groups for female victims. Very rarely are there support groups for male victims. I would say around 5 years ago now, our practice ran a group for male victims, and we had 6 people in the group. Every one of them was like, super successful, outside life was like awesome, doing good, kind of like, yeah. And their inside life was just an absolute mess, And the individual treatment, was fine. It was good. But, getting people into group therapy, for mutual support, being able to share their stories, having people not feel alone, being able to, share that dynamic of feeling like two-faced, et cetera, et cetera. The, management of hypersexuality, the religious spiritual issues, kind of, all of those dynamics, in the group therapy was absolute. It was like the most powerful experience.
Wow.
One group session, like, this isn't very good for business, but like one group session is like easy 10 individual sessions. It's so intense. It's so intense.
So we need some more of that for
We need
the
some
men.
more, but try to get people to like take off time, to like focus on their treatment. That's
Right.
like hard enough already. Try to find a mutual time for, 6 people to do anything together. And then you have the huge shame factor,
Right.
that's there. When I was speaking to all the guys, about joining this group and the importance of joining the group, all of them were like, well, let's say I know somebody in the group. Well, it's like, okay, so then, you have something on them, they have something on you, like it's a wash, it'll be okay. No, but it'll be, a position of prominence or whatever it is. And I'm like, no, I'm telling you, like, and I tried really hard to like, this guy was from that neighborhood and this guy was from this neighborhood and he was a lawyer and he was a doctor and he was an accountant and he was an Indian chief and, try to like separate all the worlds. Literally, when everybody walked in, it was, hey, Moishi, Yanko, Barrels. They're like, oh my God. It's like, all this, months of planning of like, don't worry, it's going to be fine. Like, you might not even know the guy, like different worlds. Yeah, like the Hasidic guy and the Litvish guy and like, the modern guy, like everyone was coming in and like everyone knew each other. So it was, it was literally wild, but it was amazing.
Wow. So we have, so from a treatment perspective, you were saying there's, discussing it, having someone that you could trust.
Yeah.
What other methods?
So then we kind of go into, all the treatment methods. A lot of it really relates to your theoretical orientation, in terms of how you actually do the treatment. So, there are a lot of manualized treatments, trauma-focused CBT is available, EMDR is available. Sometimes just...
What's EMDR?
EMDR is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. So it's like eye stuff. But it's a lot of kind of like unleashing, kind
It's
of
like
like
talking
a lot
about
of
what
the
happened with
inner
like
stuff.
moving the eyes back and forth.
It's wild.
Yeah.
I don't do it, but they use it a lot in Archer style. It's it's kind of like picked up in terms of its acceptance here in terms of treating trauma.
Uh-huh.
There's really good research on it. It's like really interesting.
And for some people, it's like, it's a home run, but it's like anything else. And this goes back to the conversation about, heterogeneity versus homogeneity. And that is like, you need a lot of tools in the toolbox. Because like what works for one person is just not going to work for someone else.
Yeah.
They're like, you want me to do what with my eyes? When? Huh? and it's, it's like, okay. And then like, there's some people that like I treat, a lot of people in Hasidic community. So Yiddish is not really known for its expressive language skills when it comes to feelings. So when you ask somebody, especially a guy, who doesn't have language to speak about feelings to begin with, and then you ask them to do that in English, right, it becomes very, very complicated. So a lot of these treatments are kind of based on, well, how did you feel when, right? And if he has literally 4 words in his, emotional vocabulary bank, like it's just not going to cut it. So we have to do, some other stuff. So, inner child work can be helpful. The somatic experiences can be helpful. Writing down your story. Talking about whether you want to confront the, your abuser or not. Writing a letter to the abuser. You don't even have to send it. Kind of just like, to a certain extent, like, not to minimize preschool teachers, but like sometimes I feel like a preschool teacher, and like you got to like work on the projects, you know,
to be creative.
And totally got to
Right.
be creative, like just in terms of like knowing what would work.
Very interesting. And what's like the recovery? Someone who experiences something like this, what's the recovery look like?
Yeah.
How long? And
So of the people who in the study that I did, and this was in 2005, sorry, about 20% of people who are sexually abused develop signs and symptoms of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. That's like the most intense. So one way to look at that is like, oh my gosh, 20% of people develop PTSD. The other way to look at it is 80% don't,
Right.
which is actually pretty hopeful. And, you know, obviously the earlier it can be identified, the better off somebody is. But there's a caveat there, and that is treatment before puberty has a time limit until puberty, because puberty just whacks everything up. And so if somebody enters treatment before puberty, typically they'll be fine. And then once puberty hits, like they probably have to re-enter treatment, you know, at that point to kind of like figure stuff out.
Interesting.
You know, very common, men, women, most typically women, but, you know, for men, this is true also kind of, you know, at different developmental stages when they're getting married, you know, after they have a kid, you know, sometimes that can be like a traumatic trigger. You know, so sometimes they'll have to re-enter therapy. But, you know, the point is that it's not a death sentence. You know, sometimes, you know, we'll have people call and like, oh, I just found out that, you know, my kid was abused. Is he going to be an abuser? Is he going to suffer for life? Because unfortunately, we hear like all of the gut-wrenching stories, and they're terribly, horribly gut-wrenching, and it's all true. But that might not be the norm, and that might not be the typical. And right. And it's so providing very honest hope, right, to people and to victims, you know, winds up being something really important also. And like any other therapy, you know, kind of breaking it up into stages, you know, try to understand what are our specific tasks, you know, that we want to try to accomplish. You know, what is it that you feel is broken, you know, in your life, and then, you know, really trying to work on those things.
wow. So could we discuss now, let's say, offenders?
Sure.
Some of the
Well, first, you
Therapy.
just mentioned about the people who are abused becoming abusers, right? So before we talk about like how you treat abusers,
Yeah.
do you see that as true? Like, are the abusers that you see, how many of them have been abused?
So it's like a whole square rhombus situation. In the 80s, when you could still do like cool scientific experiments on people. So probably one of the foremost researchers in this area. So he took a whole bunch of high-risk offenders who were in jail, and he asked them, how many of you were victims of sexual abuse yourself, right? How many of you were victims, not only perpetrators, but how many of you were victims? And like upwards of like 80%, you know, had indicated that they were victims also. Then he gave them a polygraph about the same question, and it dropped down to about 50%. So, you know, it's kind of assumed that somebody will say, if they're an offender, right, well, I was also a victim, right? But you kind of have to verify that information. But 50% is still, you know, a pretty high number. But that's where the whole square rhombus situation comes in, right? And that is you get a high degree of incidence of offenders who were victims of sexual abuse. But the other way is not true.
Right.
Meaning
How many
just
victims end up becoming abusers is a
Exactly.
low number.
It's a much, much lower number. Again, and it depends how we define that, right? If you have a kid who right after the victimization, you know, explores with a sibling, are you going to call that an offense? Or are you going to call that trying to figure stuff out? It you know, sometimes it's like super gray, you know, in terms of what to call that. You know, if there's a 3-year difference between, you know, if you have a 12-year-old, you know, or 13-year-old boy who was sexually abused and then, you know, abuses an 8-year-old sister. So for the sister, that's horrible. For this kid who was abused, are we calling him an offender? I mean, technically, yeah. So, you know, there's a lot of, you know, really important, you know, kind of distinctions that need to be made, and, you know, a lot obviously needs to be thought through. But you know, this goes back to the whole thing. Like, it's not a death sentence. So just because somebody's sexually abused, it does not mean that they're going to become an offender. There is a higher rate of offenders who also have, you know, that history of sexual abuse.
Right. And
Okay.
so what's the treatment look like for an abuser?
So, you know, really the first step is a really, really good completely comprehensive evaluation where we're able to make risk determinations. That's where that low, medium, and high is going to come in.
Can I just ask a question? If you're dealing with somebody that like doesn't have a conscience, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't like when you're talking of an abuser that either says, I don't care, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. Is that like psychopath?
Right.
Or is that just, is it not the word psychopathic? Or
Yeah,
is it-
no, that's a good word.
or is it like, when does in your treatment, when do you start saying, okay, this person is, it's no longer we're treating an abuser, we're
Right.
treating some like other mental disorder.
Right. Okay. So two answers. Number one is it's really important to distinguish between a sociopath and a psychopath. A sociopath is the guy that's going to tell you this was not a big deal. You know, why are you making such a big deal about it, right? That's where all the minimization comes in. Everyone's doing it, right? This is the guy where it's like, I don't want to be caught with you in a dark alley because like this is on a whole list of other conduct disorder, antisocial, you know, kind of things that he has done. And this is another thing on that list, right? He's stolen cars, he's stolen money, he steals money from pushkas, right? So that would be your typical sociopath. The psychopath is kind of like the prototypical car salesman politician type person who you kind of sit there after meeting with him, like, you know, 2-3 times, and you're like, I don't know, like, yeah, maybe that 10-year-old girl, maybe she really did want it. And then you find yourself like, what the heck did I just say? Like this guy's like super convincing, and like now he's in my head. That's your psychopath. Where it's like there's nothing overt, but like you wind up like now thinking like some really, really wacky things, and then you remember back to the textbook and you're like, this means he is a psychopath. When like you start now questioning yourself and questioning your judgment, well, you know, hey, maybe. That's
Just help me because
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
a terms guy. Sociopath is, can we define it just even for me?
Sociopath is kind of like the prototypical criminal type guy.
Okay, and the psychopath.
And the psychopath is kind of like the you know what the primary researcher, he named his book something slick and likable. It's like the guy where it's like there's something not sitting right. You kind of get the heebie-jeebie from something, but it's really hard to put your finger on it. But much more importantly, he has that gift of gab, you know, to kind of really be able to convince you or try to convince you that like whatever it is that he's trying to sell you is actually like the best snake oil that you ever want to purchase.
But they both have no empathy. Like they both don't feel bad for
So
what they did.
So the sociopath might actually feel bad, but he doesn't care that he feels bad, or he doesn't care necessarily what happened. The psychopath, you know, according to most of the research, they're kind of just like literally missing that part of their brain.
So you're saying, the question I have, is there any part of your treatment where you recognize that you're no longer treating
Right.
a regular abuse situation,
Right.
you're now treating something totally different?
Okay, so this gets to the second answer, and that is what you're describing is it exists and it's horrible, but it's so few and far between. Most typically, offenders will be either referred by community people, rabbanim, they'll self-refer because generally they feel terrible and horrible about what they've done, or they got caught. And when they get caught, they break down. That's most of the time. The stories that we hear are the horrible, terrible stories where people don't act like that and they don't do that. Those are the ones that make it to the news. Those are the ones that, you know, go to trial. Those are the ones that, you know, kind of that like really, you know, draw on our, you know, kind of part of us. But it's literally few and far between. Like, thank God, like we can't handle too many of those people. So it's horrible when that's in the room and those become like terrible management issues, and that's a real communal issue. But by and large, you know, in the scenarios, you know, kind of that we've been talking about, where you have, you know, a 16, 17-year-old, you know, guy who's abusing a sibling, that guy has been dying to apologize and to make amends and to do something about, you know, knowing that this is horrific, or when they are made aware of the impact of their actions, right? In their mind, let's say they were 16 or 17 years old, again, not excusing anything at all, but in their mind, this was kind of like a stage, and they've moved on, and they know that they've moved on, and because they're not molesting kids anymore. But it's now the 9-year-old girl who's now getting married, who now can't consummate her marriage because there are all of these horrible PTSD flashbacks that are taking place. Now he's forced to deal with this stuff, and it's kind of like this huge wake-up call, and it's like, holy cow, what did I do? That's kind of like your more typical scenario, at least that I'm seeing. I can't speak about the way. Whenever I go to conferences, right, like sex offender conferences, they give out great tote bags, by the way. So you go to these sex offender conferences, and people are just shocked. First of all, that I speak English, and second of all, that most of our referrals are not criminal justice referrals; they're community self-referrals. They're
people
referrals
who want to
by
get better.
People who want to get better. People that have brought themselves in, or people that just agreed to do it for whatever reason. Like in their world, like they've never experienced that at all. It's like so foreign to them.
Mm-hmm. So what is the treatment for someone who comes in that isn't on the sociopath or psychopath?
Right. So once we've done a really, really comprehensive assessment, and that assessment, by the way, obviously a lot of clinical interview, a lot of talking to people, kind of outside of the situation. Hey, give me 5 people who I can speak to, about you, kind of like, and in that way, relies very heavily on objective psychological tests. One of the reasons being, for what we're talking about, right, is that, I don't know, maybe they can convince you of something, but, it's tough to convince, a computer-generated program of something. So there's a lot of computer-based tests. We give people a test of sexual interest. There are actually 2 different types of sexual interest tests that we can give them. Some more invasive than others, because I want to get a really good idea of what somebody's sexually interested in. Obviously, somebody who has deviant sexual interest in kids is much more risky than somebody who abuses or molests, whatever term we want to use, who doesn't have sexual interest in kids, right? It's a very, very different, kind of dynamic that's taking place. And then most people who come in for an evaluation will also be polygraphed after, kind of all of this stuff. Wow. I want to make sure that I have the story. I want to make sure that, you're on the up and up, and people know that they're getting polygraphed. And one of the questions on the polygraph is, have you been 100% honest about your sexual history with Gavriel Fagin? And I tell everybody, if that machine goes, like, you're out. Like, I'm done with you.
Straight up.
Oh, wow.
Straight up. Like,
and
have you? Yeah, given the boot.
You've given the boot?
Yeah. And they know that ahead of time. Like, if
there's no second chance?
Nothing.
So you've actually walked someone out the door.
Mm-hmm. And it's got to be that way, because people, you've hurt somebody. That's why you're in this office as an offender, right? And I'm willing to help you if you're willing to be straight up. But if you're not straight up, I can't trust you. And if I can't trust you, that means you're high risk. And if you're high risk, you don't belong here. We got to do something else. And they know that ahead of time. So if they're failing this polygraph because they've, forgotten this, that, or the other thing. But by that time, right, we've done such an extensive history, and we've done so much testing that generally speaking, all of that comes out.
Wow. So what's the treatment once?
I'm so blown away by this. They do a polygraph. That's the coolest thing.
Yeah. So I
Tyler Rikers
no,
really,
that's really cool.
dated your view.
I feel like that's just so unusual.
The guy that I use for polygraph, I don't do the polygraph, but the guy that I send.
Do you throw in any fun questions like, do you like ice cream?
Right. So he does this really cool trick. I can't tell you what it is, but he does this really cool trick at the beginning where everyone kind of comes in, polygraph, and he does this really cool thing at the beginning where it's like, oh boy. And they're like, okay, I'll tell you the truth. And I've had guys that on their drive to the polygraph, they're like, oh, by the way, I really got to tell you something. Okay, that's a success.
Right.
That's a success. I've had the guy that I use, the primary guy that I've used, I've had people disclose to him. Like, oh, you're going to ask me that question? Even though I knew that you were going to ask me that question, this has gotten real right now. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that I need to speak about, which is great because that's what we want, right? We need that information.
Right. And once you have all the information from this polygraph.
You're like, what's the treatment?
What is the treatment?
Right.
How do you, because it seems like jail is the only, but no, we have other approaches.
So I've been working in jail. I haven't been in jail, but, and I've done treatment for people in jail. Not so much treatment. So, if the idea is to punish, jail's a great place. If the idea is to treat, not so much.
Right, 100%. Right now, a lot of the especially
That's where the justice, right? That's where the
criminal
justice system
justice
is going.
moving that jail, and it does, it's just,
Right.
it's
But
just
some people need to
door
be
that
there.
people walk right in, right out.
Right. But some people need to be there. 'Cause, yes, I want to punish you. Okay, no problem. I'm cool with that. But the treatment very much, looks at if there's a victimization history, you got to deal with the victimization before you can deal with the offending, because they were a victim before they were an offender, and you got to deal with that. So sometimes that can take a really long time, and the more extensive it is, then we also kind of want to look at the time since last offense, right? Somebody who poses an active risk, we need to do much more management of their risk than we need to do about making amends. There's a push for empathy work, to try to really get people to understand, kind of what their victim might have gone through, which is very, very important typically, for the victims as well. The research is a little mixed, whether it actually makes people less risky or not. And there's some research that if you missed diagnosing them or identifying them as psychopaths, the empathy training actually makes them into a better psychopath. So you got to be careful with that. So that's, kind of an important thing also. So some of the treatment, right, is kind of, getting in tune with that. A lot of management, how are we going to manage these, risky kind of behaviors, responsibility taking, if there is deviant sexual interest, working on the deviant sexual interest part, really going towards how can we create the best and nicest life for you and the people that you've hurt. Right? What's going to be our approach? What are positive things that we can have you involved in your life in order to give you meaning?
Wow. Do you have any stories, for let's say on the victim side as a treatment, or on the abuser side of treatment, that you could say you saw someone come in a certain type? You're not giving away obviously any private information, but what something looked like, and then the recovery and how that looked at the end.
So, the really great part is if somebody can stick it out, if somebody can stick out the treatment, you see like this incredible growth and change in people. Sometimes just sharing it when somebody, kind of comes in and just shares this thing that they've never shared before, like you physically see on their body, like, them losing 100 pounds of emotional stuff, of emotional baggage. That ability to just share it and connect with somebody, it's huge. You see it in terms of regulation, mood regulation, sexual regulation. You see those changes in terms of quality of relationships. They change. You have somebody who's, either at one end of just, being totally passive, or you have the passive aggressive guy, or you have the guy who's always aggressive. The changes that are taking place as things, get resolved, just in terms of like their interpersonal stuff. If religion and spirituality is, something that they're plagued with, you see changes there, right? It's not only kind of just like blah, 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 tefillin, right? But it has like some meaning to them, if that's something that they want to do. Some victims, were victimized by, rabbanim or teachers or whatever it is, and they're done. They just want nothing to do with it. Okay. At some point, maybe we'll deal with that if that's something that's important to them. Mm-hmm. You see, like for some people, their souls are dead from being sexually abused. They're walking dead people. And through treatment, through just that ability to connect and share a story and, kind of work through some issues, like you can literally see sometimes, like, after whatever amount of sessions, like their eyes just like have life again. Like there's a smile, there's a twinkle, that kind of just like comes alive if they're dealing with, addiction issues, whether it's sexual addiction or, substances, kind of just like the reliance on those things get down. Obviously we talk about eating disorders in women. We talk about it a lot, and obviously it needs to be spoken about. Male victims of sexual abuse sometimes have eating disorders also. So you see changes in that. Self-harm behaviors, right? It looks very different for men and women, a lot of self-harm behavior. But for men, it's not necessarily cutting themselves, but you see it a lot in aggressive driving. You see it in, a lot of, let's call it the extracurricular risk-taking stuff.
Any particular story that you could, without giving away any names or too many good, important facts, but just like a story that some of our listeners might be able to hold on to or use as a chizuk?
So, I don't want to sound like grandma, but like everyone's important, and everyone's story is just so meaningful. And I respect so much, somebody that's able to come in and like have the courage, to be able to share like their deepest, darkest secrets. And that's true of the offenders, by the way. So on it, like, I really don't want to sound like grandma, but like every story is just, it's so touching. It's so heart wrenching. It's so painful. Maybe I guess a situation that, kind of stands out the most is, a family where the grandfather in the family probably abused 50 to 60 of both male and female grandchildren, children, grandchildren. That's probably the most, and I was on the victim end, dealing with the victims on that one. That probably was the most heart-wrenching, kind of.
And how was like what was the
long-term outcomes?
So, it really depends on when somebody got treatment, who they got treatment with, how supportive spouses and friends were. That a lot of it is personality based. Which is why there's no distinct trajectory, unfortunately, in terms of how somebody's. There's just so many factors, that are there. So it's a horrible, horrific test case because you kind of see you have right
the same facts,
the same facts with different people, and you kind of see like all the 12 different directions that it can go.
Wow. Have you ever been, I know this might be a personal question, but these are such intense, sometimes moving stories. You ever find yourself like emotional during treatment, like crying or doing something like that with a patient?
Yeah. So never in, but definitely sometimes like, before and after. Never in. I have a pretty good poker face. So, which I think, is important for them. Because if I can't hold their reality, then it's like all heck breaks loose.
Wow.
But, some of the questions that kind of come up with that is, boundaries are super important in the therapeutic context, right? And especially with somebody who is sexually abused, right? The physical touch and just proximity, right, is always an issue for them. So somebody breaks down crying, like the first thing you want to do is give them a hug, right? Or when they're leaving the therapy session, you're just like, hey, I want to give you a hug, but you can't. And that actually winds up sometimes being like the most gut-wrenching part. Because like I'm a hugger. Like I'm a hugger guy. So, but like in the therapeutic context, like you can't go there. And sometimes it's interesting, like that like tends to be, or like really wanting to like, text or WhatsApp somebody like after a session or 2 days later and being like, hey bro, how you doing? The therapeutic boundaries there are, some people appreciate it and some people get where you're coming from. Some people it's like, this is creepy. Like, why is he doing that? And then now you're the next creep, kind of in their life. So those boundaries, like to navigate, all of those things are like, really, really complicated. But it really brings up the issue of self-care, of anybody dealing with trauma, especially when it comes to sexual abuse, like having, a pretty decent, if decent to good, kind of self-care plan is like really, really important. I say all the time that I like really wish I could just open up a flower shop because that would just be awesome, and I'll just do that. But, I guess Hashem had different plans and, kind of put me here.
You could say like, like how many people do you think have you been helped in the last?
Listen, I don't know about help, right? It's really hard to know. And, how do you judge that? And, but we did a count recently, of myself and my partner and all of our associates. And now everything is kind of, digital. So it's, easy to do. Right. But like, we've seen close to like 25,000 cases.
Wow.
Whoa.
I mean, it's,
okay, I did not think you were going to say such a high number.
Sometimes it's like, a 3 and done or a 1 and done kind of thing. Like, guys messing around in yeshiva, like that's a case, right? Sometimes it's, well, maybe I was abused. Sometimes it's OCD surrounding abuse issues, right? So it's not only, right, the sexual abuse thing, like we'll also deal with sexual addiction. So I don't want to kind of like overplay it at all.
That's a humongous number.
It's a huge number.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
Now, again, it's across a whole bunch of people, right, over a whole bunch of time. And, so, we have to kind of like, break down the statistics and put it into context there. But yeah, because if you think about it, again, going back to the numbers, right, if you take the small definition or the large definition, right, 1 in 5 means that 2 people in a million of guys were sexually abused. Now, not all of them are going to have not all of them will be terribly impacted. In fact, most of them will not be terribly impacted, but it's still a thing. So, the potential numbers there are huge.
Wow.
Okay. But there's hope in the treatment.
There's a lot of hope. That's the thing. Like,
I like to end on a positive note.
It is a positive. 25,000 is humongous.
It's
a great positive.
the
It's a lot of
positive
awareness.
There's a lot of awareness that's taking place. But before I came here, right, there was a Hasidic institution that called and they needed some advice. Usually those calls are, we have a Rebbe who blah blah blah. What do we do? Right, and it's like, fire him. It's like I'll charge you money to like tell you like 2 words, right? But they handled the case so well. They were talking. They called about a detail of a detail of a detail of how to handle blah blah blah. Aspect of the situation. But as soon as they found out about something, the guy was out the next day. They had informed parents. They did every step in the playbook they had done.
That's great.
5 years ago, 3 years ago, and this was kind of pre-chaos in the past couple of weeks. This was done in the summer. The amount of change that's taking place, and I don't think it gets enough play. Unfortunately, we kind of tend to focus on what we're not doing right instead of what we are doing right. There's so much. The amount of abuse prevention programs. You said your daughter had one. The abuse prevention programs. The sheer number of people who call and who ask about establishing protocols in schools. And then they follow up and say, such and such, was that a boundary violation? Is this something that needs to be documented? How do we deal with this teacher? And it was like, he put his arm around him. Sometimes that's fine. Sometimes it's not. Depends on context, et cetera, et cetera. But they're asking the minutia, let's call it, right?
That's
and they're certainly asking. So there's this like, there's this huge change associated with, what it is, that's people are sensitized to, which is absolutely amazing. People are coming out earlier, in terms of their abuse, and typically when moms or dads, but it's moms usually, kind of call frantic of like, my kid is now going to be a molester, there's so much hope that's there. And even for the adolescent offenders, most typically, research tells us upwards of 80, low 90%, like they're not going to be adult offenders. Like they're going to be okay. That doesn't mean that they didn't leave chaos in their wake, right? And that's going to need to be dealt with at some point. But they themselves, right, are going to be okay. Moms say all the time, like, I feel like I gave birth to a monster. No, you gave birth to a kid who did something really, really stupid, horrible, might have affected somebody else's life. But if we just kind of focus on the what's going to be with him aspect of it, right, we get the right treatment, we do the right management, like he'll probably be okay.
Right. So that's great. Okay, I'll end with one question. If you could give a message to the listeners, let's say who are not offenders and were not abused, hopefully, right? What would it be? Like, what could the regular person, like, what do you want people to know?
I think the regular person, let's say that regular person is a parent, right? So we got to do all that we can, right, in order to keep our kids safe. So a lot of that are the prevention programs in school. If your schools don't have prevention programs, they need to have prevention programs. If the schools don't have protocols in terms of how teachers and principals are interacting with the kids, they need to have those things. Teachers need to be trained, properly in terms of appropriate interaction, right? I go into schools, camps, super really important. I go into, probably 12 camps before, and I'm one guy, Amudim, does crazy thing, and Relief Resources also does, right? Amazing stuff. And I'm one guy, and I'm going into, right, 12 camps, just the amount of prevention, and you literally just scare the bejeebies out of the guys in camp. Like, you will be arrested. Like, I'm just going to be straight up with you. Like, I consult with the camp. If they call me and they tell me that you did such and such, I will tell them, have him arrested. And the numbers drop by a lot,
Wow.
right, in terms of what it is that's going on. But it's not foolproof. So the average parent, right, is you got to do the abuse prevention. It starts really early. Abuse prevention is not a static thing. Okay, check mark, I did this. I talked to my kid about this, right? It's ongoing. Every developmental stage, making sure that schools have those proper programs in place, making sure that there are all the prevention programs, making sure that the schools have the protocols in place, making sure that, dorm yeshivas, right, have some sort of system in place where you're talking to the guys. Because you have a bunch of teenage guys living under one roof. They're going to do stupid stuff. So, making sure that, there are programs involved with that. Early identification, of pornography issues, kind of like your typical, teaching Rebbeim signs and symptoms of, of what to look for specifically. So that would be, kind of the average parent. The average, guy in shul, you never know what somebody's gone through. Right. So, kind of like sometimes, the innuendo jokes. I'm not talking about it from a religious, or spiritual standpoint at all. But you never know how somebody's responding to somebody, being like a friend with like, an open ear and open eyes and like really hearing what somebody's going through. Like, it's huge. You really could save somebody. Or you save somebody even though you feel I didn't do anything. Yes, you did. You just listened. You just listened. And, we don't want to offer advice, necessarily without, kind of knowing the full picture. But that ability to just literally be there for somebody, is huge.
Wow.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
This is really,
Pleasure.
amazing.
Very nice and amazing.
I don't know about you, but I learned so much on this episode. It's one of those episodes where I'm like sitting in the room by a lot of these conversations. But even if it's like 2 weeks later that we're editing it, this was an episode that I'm going to listen to a few times because there's just so many just insightful and just important information to know. And I think everyone in this episode did a good job. Like, this is a very heavy topic, and I do think this was done in a way that was just easy to listen to, Sometimes during these episodes, I'm in the background trying to do some, other work. Maybe we're doing some logos or some graphics for other episodes. But this one, it was just too distracting for me to get anything else done. I just had to like listen, and it's a very sad topic, and there's a lot of people that have gone through so much, and I hope this helps. Just a little bit, and then as everyone knows, if you're listening and if you unfortunately were a victim or you unfortunately were an offender, there is hope. And if you're not sure where to turn to, I highly recommend to turn to Relief, and they'll point you in the right direction and connect you with the right person for you to help you get the help that you need. And until next time, stay safe. Living Lchaim.